YouTube, which is on the website, and the Der Nister Facebook page specifically. I believe it might not be.
Yeah, we'll see. This is the first one, so anything can happen.
All right, so let's just start right here. Welcome to everyone who's watching from. I mean, we even have the legends of the UK. So I mean, that's just an incredible set of people, as well as anybody who's watching on the stream or anyone who sees this later on. This is the first event of Der Nister, and Der Nister is a new synagogue project right here in Mr. Henry Hollander's bookstore in downtown LA. I'm Rabbi Zach Golden, the guy right over here. And what we plan to do is when COVID starts melting away, we want to be a center of learning and community for Jews in the downtown area who I think we believe have been underserved, but also to provide new intellectual, cultural, and spiritual stimulus for the wider Jewish world. And to that end, we thought, well, there's no way better to start than with the very definition of stimulus itself, the Nach movement. And Brett Kopin, my dear friend, here to present on Nach, on Saba, whose ideology started this particular movement, and the crazy trance music that accompanies that. And with that, I'm gonna give this mic to Henry to also say hello.
Hello. This sort of version of Der Nister is not really what we intended. We were hoping to have people together in the same place, and that is where we hope to arrive in the long run. And so we hope to welcome you here sometime down the line.
So for now, what I want to do is first let me introduce Brett. He I think everyone here might know him, but let me make sure everyone does know. He's I believe a fifth and final year at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. He has great interest and passion for Chassidut, as well as other more esoteric fields of Jewish study and thought. And he has a particularly special relationship with the subject that we're presenting, as he spent time in Israel with very much in the center circle of the Nanak movement, which is sweeping the world. And it's through him we're going to get tremendous insight on this movement. So yeah, anything you'd like to say, Brett, as we start off?
Just that it's great to be here, and it's an honor to help you kick off Der Nister. I think very, very excited to see where you guys go from here.
Well, thank you. So I think the first thing we should do is demonstrate to people who might not know or might be sort of familiar, who are the Nanak people and where will you find them?
So I think the best way of demonstrating this first is probably just to show a little clip of just as a means of a short introduction. So let me 1 second. Here we go. All right, so I just want to start. Can you see the my shared screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to hear, but just imagine that there's intense trance music going on. Just everywhere, anywhere.
You should be able to share your audio. I don't know if that's anyway.
Sharing audio is very difficult. I think oh, there it is.
So on the face of it, I think what most people know about the Nanak movement is what they see of the Nanak movement. So when you go through Israel, you'll basically any wall you look on, bus stops, alleyways, restaurants, you'll see this graffiti that's painted everywhere that will say Nach, Nachman, Nachman Mi'uman. And as a part of that slogan, Nach, Nachman Mi'uman, you have people whose sole purpose essentially is to go around Israel in vans, most often vans that they'll spray paint, blasting music, and usually it's Nanak music. And they will just get out and randomly start having dance parties all over Israel. This is a movement that really started to take off in the 90s around a charismatic figure named Yisroel Dov Ber Odesser, who he claimed to have found a secret note from heaven, that the origin was from heaven. And in this note, we get the expression Na Nach Nachman Me'uman, and that the goal of this group is essentially to spread this message throughout Israel, not only by spray painting it, but also by hosting these big dance parties. And this started off as sort of a small fringe movement in the 90s. And since then, it's exploding, and it continues to explode. And the more that time goes on, seemingly that the greater and greater this movement's going to become. So that's a little bit of a brief introduction on who they are.
And so they are probably ultra orthodox in terms of their approach, yet they do a lot of like heavy trance music and graffiti. It seems like their reach is pretty outside of the normal cloistered yeshiva world.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't necessarily say. First of all, we can't speak for all of them in one general categorization. From my knowledge, I wouldn't necessarily say that they are an ultra orthodox group. It seems more to be in line somewhere closer to a Baal Tshuva group. So people who didn't necessarily grow up in this particular tradition, but found it later on and came to it later on. And it's an interesting observation, Zach, that you make, that there is this seeming crossover between this house trance music and what their songs and what their particular music in this group of Jewish people tend to play. A lot of them come from secular backgrounds, kind of like clubbing backgrounds, but then when they find this purpose through becoming Balei Tshuva, that music and that way of life gets taken from sort of like the partier way of life and gets projected into this very specific movement. This movement, the Nanachers, is an offshoot of Breslov, of the Breslov Hasidim community. And for those who don't know, the Breslov community originates from the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. So Rabbi Nachman, he's known as the Rav of this community in Poland. The reason why the slogan, though, says Nachman Me'uman and not Nachman from Breslov is because Uman was the place that he died and is buried. And so today, on Rosh Hashanah especially, so in a couple of weeks, depending on, it's going to be interesting to see what happens considering that we're still in a global pandemic. But there are up to 50,000 and more people who will travel to Rabbi Nachman's grave every Rosh Hashanah. And the reason for that is that Rabbi Nachman himself said that if you want to spend Rosh Hashanah with him, you need to go to his kever, to his grave, and spend Rosh Hashanah there.
Wow. So the way Nach formed off of Breslov is has to do with this character Saba, Rav Odesser, that we've been talking about. Who is Saba? Where was he found, and what happened to him?
So I'm not necessarily a biographer on Saba, and I think it's worth a couple words of context for why I know what I know about Saba. I had the opportunity and privilege of living in Sfat for a couple months back in 2014, and the people that I lived with and were surrounded by were essentially disciples of Saba. And so through knowing them, I got to know briefly, but in a very special way, the inner circle of people who were around Saba during his lifetime. So a few words of just who Saba is in some context. Saba was somebody who, when he was younger, his last name is Odesser because his family comes from the town of Odessa. And when he was younger, he was just a bacher, a person studying in a yeshiva, and he really found his meaning, and his soul was called to the teachings of Rabbi Nachman. So he wasn't born a Breslover; he found it when he was younger, and this is really important to note. But when Saba was younger, and as somebody studying in a yeshiva, Rabbi Nachman was not widely studied at all, and if anything, the Breslov movement was a marginal movement. And the teachings weren't well known like they are today. And Saba encountered his teachings early on and started studying them sort of in private. And there's a very famous story, and this is sort of where his spiritual biography really starts to take off, that he was studying in Tiberias in the yeshiva of Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes. So for those who are familiar with Rabbi Meir, he was the direct disciple of Rabbi Akiva, along with Shimon Bar Yochai. His wife was Beruria, who's one of the female voices mentioned in the Talmud. So he was at this yeshiva, and he was feeling very weak. And the 17th of Tammuz came around, and the 17th of Tammuz is one of the fast days on the Jewish calendar. And he felt weak, and that he couldn't do the fast that day. And so on the 17th of Tammuz, he broke his fast, and and as the story goes, he was very depressed about the fact that this happened. And about a week later, as the story goes, it was the 24th of Tammuz. He had this strong feeling to go to his room to a bookcase that was locked, and he had the key on him, and he unlocks the bookcase. And he opens up one of his books to try to find some sort of inspiration to take him out of his depression. And when he opens up his book, this mysterious note falls out. So I'm going to show you right now what this note looks like. Let's see.
Which is what's referred to as the petek.
Yeah, the petek. So the petek is the Hebrew word for note here. So you can see a picture of it right here. It's this old piece of paper that comes out of this note, and he picks it up, and this is what the note says to him. So this is the text, and just for those who don't read Hebrew, the note starts out in Hebrew, will then go to Yiddish, and then we'll go back to Hebrew towards the end. So the note says, "Very hard it was for me to descend to you, my precious student, to tell you that I benefited greatly from your service. And upon you, I said, my fire will burn until Messiah will come. Be strong and brave in your service." And then it says, and this is on a separate line by itself, "Na Nach Nachman Nachman Me'uman. And with this I shall reveal to you a secret, and it is full and heaped up from line to line." Then we see these letters, which some claim is the name of an angel. "And with strong service you will understand it. And the sign is the 17th of Tammuz. They will say that you are not fasting."
Wow.
Now, remember, according to Saba's story, the reason why he was depressed in the first place was that he was not fasting on the 17th of Tammuz. And this line is at the end is telling him the way that you know that this letter is legitimate is the fact that on the 17th of Tammuz, people know about you that you weren't fasting, and that I know this about you too, and that's why that line is included. So it's also important to know that when he found this note, again, I'll scroll back up so you can see the picture. I don't know if this will get bigger. Okay, yeah, here we go. Here's in a large picture. When he first found this note, he told a couple people about it, but it wasn't like this note became something popular. It wasn't like the phrase "Na Nach Nachman Nachman Me'uman" started to get written and painted all over Israel. That did not happen. He found this note when he was in his mid-20s. And when he was 86 years old, there were a couple Baalei Tshuva who went to his nursing home, which was in Ra'anana, and basically picked him to be their spiritual leader, and that they decided to form a circle around him. So from the time he was 86 years old until I believe he died about 20 years later, the record says he dies when he's 106. Not totally clear how old he was. I don't know how good the birth records were back then. But for the next 20 years, he really became the charismatic leader of this movement. And his Baalei Tshuva, his disciples, took him out of his nursing home. And I actually had the privilege of meeting Saba's grandson. And Saba's grandson actually said, I asked him, why was he willing to go with these people? He actually said it's because he didn't like the way that the nursing home smelled. And so he was happy just living in other people's houses and to be taken around from place to place. And they call him Saba because Saba means grandfather. He was an old man when they found him, when he became their leader. And he was very well taken care of by all accounts. He went from house to house. People treated him probably like he was a king. And his students would just sit at his feet and learn from him. And it's important to know, it wasn't that the only message that he was carrying was Nanak Nachman Meuman, and was the fact that he found this mysterious letter in a book. The real message that he was carrying, which is also the real message of the whole Nanak movement, is that if you want to bring the Mashiach, if you want the Mashiach to come, and if you want the redemption to come, you need to spread Rabbi Nachman's teachings all over the world. So Saba was so charismatic that he was basically wheelchair bound. And as somebody who was bound to a wheelchair, he wound up collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in his lifetime as people wanted to help and support him in his mission. And when he died, he used that money to establish a publishing house for Rabbi Nachman's works, so that these works can continue to be spread throughout the Jewish world, because for him, that was the mission. He was a Breslover, and he said the most important thing for us to do is to keep popularizing the teachings of Rabbi Nachman and to spread them throughout the world. And we have a video of him. If you go on YouTube, there are a bunch of different videos of Saba. And one of them is of him sitting in a field in a car where two of his students are talking to him, and they ask him, how, what's your proof that the Mashiach is coming? And what he says to them, which is a really interesting answer, is when he became a follower of Rabbi Nachman, nobody, like I said before, nobody was studying Rabbi Nachman. It was the Breslov movement was still a very fringe movement. And then he said from that point, when he was in his mid-20s and became a student of Rabbi Nachman, to that point during his, when he was talking, he was in his mid-90s, Rabbi Nachman exploded as an influential rabbi. So he went from somebody whose teachings were marginal to somebody who became the most popular Hasidic Rebbe of the generation. And for somebody like Saba, who had that perspective, that to him was the miracle of his time. It wasn't necessarily the fact that he found this note. It was the fact that he knew that Rabbi Nachman's teachings needed to be spread, and it was literally happening during his lifetime.
So now what I'm gonna say is at 15 till the next hour, I'm gonna open up for people to question in any way. But for now, if anybody's interested in fielding in sending, actually there are not that many people here. So anyone who wants to ask a question, just I don't know, Zoom raise your hand or just ask. But I want to ask one more question before I open it up to other people. If I could, I had the question in my head like 2 seconds ago. Actually, wait.
I also just want to say this is an incredible group of people that I didn't realize when I was talking, but Eric's here, Zusha, Leon, the Legends of the UK, David. This is such a good group. So,
this is absolutely. No, it's absolutely. Actually, so one thing. This is what I was going to ask. So Saba's goal was to spread the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, and the proof of the power of this messianic sort of fervor for him was that so many people, Baalei Tshuva mostly, out of nowhere, were spreading this petek, this teaching all over the world. But what seems to be even more of an intense driver than even Rabbi Nachman's teachings to non-Nach success, or even the popularity of Breslov, is the idea of liot besimcha, and like being in a constant state of joy at any time and everywhere in a way that isn't supposed to make sense and isn't really seen as normal in the Jewish world. Like, I think, the Hasidim do believe that, but like this is what they do is taking it to a certain level. Is this a conscious goal of Saba to bring this in very intense joy and this teaching about it?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. There's actually another short clip I want to show about that. Is this it? Yeah, here we go.
If you hit optimize for video, it makes the sound a little better. I don't know.
David, how do I do that?
Reshare again, start again, and there's a little click box that says optimize for video. I learned that doing group movie watching.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you for teaching me that. Okay.
Thank you. So the reason why I love showing that video is because, yeah, so Zach, as you said, really what so much of Rabbi Nachman's, first of all, Rabbi Nachman is so expansive, and his teachings and his theology are so complex. But if you, when you really start to get into it, one of the tenets of Rabbi Nachman's whole theology is that our service to God is radical joy. That often that the sake of doing mitzvot and the reason for doing mitzvot is because mitzvot should inspire in you a sense of joy, and that if you live in the realm of joy, that's part of your devotional service to God. And who Saba was as a person when they basically took him in as their Rebbe at the age of 86, he was somebody who totally embodied radical joy. So all the videos that you'll watch of him, no matter where they are, all the video clips they have of Saba, he will always be laughing. He will always be engaged in some sort of fit of laughter. And even as an 86-year-old who then lived until past 100 years old, he was always like that. And I really do think that part of the charismatic leader persona, what happens is they rub off on their followers in such a way that then laughter itself becomes a virtue and joy itself becomes a virtue, because that's the way that their leader behaved. The clip I just showed was from a trip that Saba's followers took him to France, and it was some sort of event hall. And you see him just as this, he's not just this old man in a wheelchair, he's literally the center of the party. And you have people screaming and dancing around him, touching him and kissing their hands and going to him for blessings. That was the effect that he had on people. So the joy for him was completely, the joy and the service were basically one and the same. And I think that's kind of interesting because, you find all these statements in the Talmud about not losing your head and not laughing too much and not being too joyous. And he sort of blows the roof off of all of it. You said something really interesting when we were talking before about I asked you if Nanak transforms the people who are in it to be so exuberantly joyous. What does it do to the people who join this movement?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because I think that's such an interesting sociological, phenomenon of, what is the fervor? I don't know, because I personally have never been the kind of person to just jump out in the middle of the street and start a dance party, but I respect people who want to do that. And the truth is, it does bring a lot of joy to people. I imagine when you see a group of people doing that, and you jump in, you very quickly can mold into that kind of persona and have that kind of character to just, with absolutely no abandon, just be able to jump out of a car and start a dance party and make people happy. And then in terms of the Robbie Nachman books, if you actually go to Nanak centers where they actually station themselves, there will be tents with videos of Saba talking, but then they will also mostly have Robbie Nachman books around them too. And Zach, and and what we said before, I think what's so interesting about the Nanak movement is that they're able to become so noticed, having only really been around for about 30 years. So Saba was, again, he was discovered either in the 80s or the 90s, like whatever, in the last couple decades. And in that time, like he's really become a phenomenon throughout Israel and among the Jewish people. Even when you're not in Israel, you still see the Nanak Kippahs. People know who the Nanachs are. I've had a bumper sticker in my room since I was 15 that says Nanak Nachman Me'uman. It is a culture it's permeating the Jewish world, and by all accounts, it will keep growing bigger and bigger.
Yeah, that is. I mean, it is extraordinary that. I mean, I remember being in Jerusalem in Mea Shearim in the ultra Orthodox neighborhood where people are very dour, and the van goes by, and instead of people becoming upset, they just like they look up from what they're doing, they smile, they like take a break, all the heaviness falls off of them, and they shake their heads and then move on with the day. But they don't.
And a lot of us too. I'm sure other people on this call have been in a similar situation. You're with a group, maybe from high school, maybe some kind of camping trip, and you're walking through Ben Yehuda Street. All of a sudden, the Nanak party begins, and you just drop whatever you're doing, and you join them, and you do a quick hora. And I've done that a couple times, and it's just and then you do it, and then it's over, and then you just move on with the rest of your day. But it's incredible that's what these people do. They're literally there to have these pop-up dance parties all over the place, and it's pretty incredible. And what you and I talked about before, one of the things that I think makes them unique, and I think this is important, that oftentimes a lot of fringe groups, for whatever reason, will espouse some kind of philosophy that might be dangerous in whatever way. These people, they don't seem to pose any sort of threat at all. They seem to be people who literally just want to spread joy and just spread the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, and that seems to be the entire goal. And part of that too, and I think it's worth saying right now, it's because Saba was like that. I think Saba really was a tzaddik. He really was that personality. And I spoke with his grandson back in 2014, and him and his wife were telling me that as Saba was attracting more and more followers, they would say to him, and I think this is a frequent thing that happens for people who go down that track and become Baal Tshuva, they would say to him that they didn't feel comfortable anymore eating in their parents' houses. And this is because the parents don't keep the same level of kashrut, or maybe the parents were secular and they wanted to keep kashrut, they couldn't even eat there. And Saba would reassure all of his students and say, no, those are your parents. You only have one set of parents. And there are things that you can do to make sure that your kashrut is respected, but kibud av v'em, honoring your father and your mother, is the fifth commandment. It's one of the most, it's the foundation of our entire faith. So there's no excuse for you not to go back to your parents' house and to eat with them. Take a paper plates, take plastic forks and knife, and just make it work.
Yeah, no, I had no idea. That's a very beautiful story.
So
David.
Yeah, right. So it's radical joy, and it's also radical inclusivity. And I think that is what the movement is about.
No, it makes it all make sense. David, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Brett, for all this great information. My question is, or I have a couple. One is, do you think that the reputation that you tend to know the Nanachs for, of just like being this thing that you like smile for a bit and then go on with your day, do you think that detracts from the mission that you were saying that Saba kind of put centrally, which is the study of Rabbi Nachman? Like, in what ways does this dance party lead to the study of Rabbi Nachman? And maybe it does for some, and maybe it does for some. I mean, what's your perception of that? And then the other thing is just like more of how you've been affected by this movement personally, just a little bit more of the personal experience and the conversations you've had. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. Two really great questions. I think one of the things that's so awesome about the Nanak movement is that the dance parties is their form of kiruv. So kiruv is it just means bringing somebody closer, bringing somebody into the fold. So if you only know the Nanachers in the context of, for the last, let's say you move to Israel and they're a group of people, who just look like rebels in some kind of way, who start random dance parties, and you know them as those crazy guys who just have dance parties. I think at a certain point, you start to recognize them. You start to learn a little bit more about who they are. And I think the goal is, if you don't have interest in Robbie Nachman in the moment, that's okay. Join us for our dance party, stop for 5 minutes and just get out some of your energy and then move along with your day. But again, I think what they're doing is their form of kiruv, which is we're going to keep dancing. We're going to keep spreading Nanak Nachman and graffiti on walls and bus stops, outside restaurants, on the sidewalks, everywhere. And slowly you'll start to learn more about who we are and our mission, but we're not going to force it down your throat. What we will do is we'll offer you a fun time for 5 minutes. But to me, that's the same thing as any rabbi inviting somebody into their house for Shabbat dinner. And you go in the beginning because it's an awesome community. There starts to be a consistent group who goes, and you want to see these people and you want to spend Shabbat. Maybe this becomes your Shabbat community. And then after a while, the rabbi might say to you, why don't you come back to my house on a Wednesday and we'll study something together? And then all of a sudden you become a student. And that's that form of kiruv. So I think in a certain way, having these dance parties is a pretty radical form of kiruv, because what it is doing is it is helping spread the message. So for it, if 1,000 people are doing these dance parties, maybe 10 or 20 of them will buy Robbie Nachman books. I'm sure the number's higher than that, but maybe 10 or 20 of them will. But that number will just keep growing. And then those people will try to bring their friends in. And I think that's sort of like what they're doing. And it comes back to kiruv. With me and my personal experience, I think what this learning about Saba, meeting his grandson, meeting his close circle of followers, really helped me sort out what goes into these charismatic personalities that turn somebody from a regular person who has either a really fascinating, mysterious story, like finding a note from heaven, or somebody who is a gaon who knows tons and tons of Torah, but doesn't necessarily have followers. What's that thing that takes that person from just another person who might be learned to somebody who becomes one of these cult icons, who becomes an icon around Israel, who really starts to affect culture in this very particular way. And Saba, to me, is an example of somebody, a very strong example of someone who is like that. In the same way that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is like that, right? That how do we create these personalities that really start to influence tons and tons of people? And it seems that even after they die, their persona just keeps growing larger and larger and larger. To me, that's such a fascinating phenomenon, and we see it happening over and over and over again. And so this whole experience that I had with Saba and his followers really helped me to clarify a lot of how that works.
All right. Zusha, you had your hand up. Anything you'd like to?
Yeah. Brett, thanks so much for taking us through this world. And I appreciate you kind of locating this as well in your own personal history. Thanks for sharing that. I'm wondering, since kind of to go a little bit further into the point you just made about Saba, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, cults of personality, movement building. I was wondering if you could kind of just go a little further into situating all of this historically and sociologically. Like, why it, beyond the appeal of the texts themselves and the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, why did this grow so quickly? Saba and the kind of rise of the Nach movement also happened during a time of tremendous change in, 1990s in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, the Oslo Accords, the devolution of all of those things. Like, so much is happening historically. Also, the draw of the Nanak movement is also so pan-ethnic within Israel. And I'm curious about that. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of go a little bit further to situate all of this within the larger historical trends.
Yeah, for sure. And also, Zusha, I have to say, it's so great to see you again and to, be able to have this interaction. It's been a couple of years. So this group really warms my heart. It's interesting because, like I said earlier, Rabbi Nachman, I think from the time Saba was young and then through Saba's life, really grew to become one of the great rabbis. One of our professors from Ziegler, Rav Güller, talks about how every generation takes up a certain rabbi, and how a generation ago it was really Rabbi Nachman was the rabbi, and now it seems to be the growing trend that the Piazetzner Rebbe is becoming one of the great like Hasidic masters of our generation, of our time, because we see an explosion of his writings and people reading and talking about him in a way they weren't doing before. So I don't know. I feel like so many different factors go into the phenomenon of what takes a movement from some small fringe obscure movement into something that just keeps growing larger and larger. And I think that has a lot to do with the popularization of Rabbi Nachman, and I'm not sure if that is all due to the non-Nach movement. I think Rabbi Nachman also became popular independently of the non-Nach movement. I think they were a part of it for sure, but I definitely think that the two are related. As Rabbi Nachman gained more credibility as a Rebbe, as somebody people wanted to turn to, as Likutei Maharan, which is a collection of his teaching, started to spread and people studied it. I think all that stuff sort of started to work together in order to really enlarge this persona. And yeah, and I don't know, and that would be fascinating what you're saying too in the 90s, like how much upheaval is going on culturally at that time, and did people perceive that Saba was sort of an answer to all that? The fact that he can take a trip to France and it's not just like 10 friends of the followers knew who he was and came over for dinner. It's the guy literally started the party in a huge hall with hundreds of people, and they're all surrounding him and kissing him. That must have taken a couple years, 4 or 5 years from the time he was taken from the nursing home until that point. And I think that's such an interesting question of what leads to that kind of movement and that kind of motion, and really embracing a figure as this Rebbe and as this person you can go to for blessings.
I think that's kind of the essential question is, I mean, maybe this is from a Reconstructionist lens, I don't know, but like essentially like why do Jews need the Judaism they're simultaneously creating is a question I think that's kind of essential as we see these cults of personality come up, who are also like the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Saba, who are both very much, and the Nanak movement, who are very much in touch, not just in this kind of Haredi circle, but are very much interested in being out in the public sphere. Like, what about what's happening in the public is needs response from this kind of religious movement, I think is something that's we're going to puzzle ourselves on, or I think it's something that we need to be kind of thinking about now that we have some historical distance from these things.
Yeah,
I appreciate all of this. Thanks so much for bringing this out to us. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And the other thing I'm going to add too is just like going over to a great and warm household for Shabbat dinner, which from your end, not only is it low commitment, but it's a thing that's enjoyable to do. I think to become a member of the Nach movement, they're not asking for that much. They're asking that you help popularize the song, essentially. They're asking that you help spread the message, which is Nanak Meuman, and that if we want the Mashiach to come, we have to start spreading Rabbi Nachman's teachings. Just a word on that phrase, Nanak Meuman. This is sort of going deeper into the theology of their movement. But in the Zohar, it says that there are 10 songs that will appear throughout Jewish history, and all of these songs will lead to certain redemptions. So one of the songs is Shirat Hayam. So when Moshe, after they leave Egypt, they sing a song after going through the Red Sea. And this is a song that we still sing every Psukei de Zimra. In the morning service, as Jews, we sing the song every morning. That was one of the 10 songs. And in its historical period, that song led to a certain redemption. Then there were other songs. Shir HaShirim is another song, traditionally written by King Solomon, the Song of Songs. So what they believe is, and in the Zohar it says that at the end of time, before the ultimate redemption, there will be another song that comes out. The 10th song will come. And the song is based on God's 4-letter name, but Yud, Yud He Vav, Yud He Vav He. And it's the same progression as Nach, Nachman Meuman. And so the theology of the belief is not that we know what that song is, because we don't know what the song is yet, but we can warm ourselves up and we can begin to practice a proto version of the song, which is Nach Nachman Meuman, which is totally kosher to say. And that by practicing this song and popularizing it, it means that by the time the ultimate song comes out based on God's name, everybody in the world, or all the Jews at least, are going to be primed to be able to sing the song, because the Jews will have either heard or seen Nanak Nachman Meuman, and that's sort of like the teacher of what the ultimate song is going to be. So part of that theology is, if we spray paint this name all over Israel, whether or not people dance with us, they're going to know about this, and they can sing along with us and help us bring the redemption when it comes. And that's sort of one of the foundations of that theology.
Yeah, it's interesting what Zusha is bringing up, because when you think of every major messianic movement of Jewish history, it was never a movement. It was rarely a movement of elites. It was always a movement reaching out to the common people, and it all spoke to the common masses differently. For example, Shabbatai Tzvi, with his like trampling on tefillin, was like saying to the Spanish Jews who had lost their ways that actually those things don't matter. Only what's in your heart matters. I think each movement that of people who have suffered want a messianic movement, and they want a specific one that validates their way of life to the extent that it can. Leon, I think you had a question you wanted to bring in.
Yeah, so thank you, Brad. I mean, you actually, I had two questions, one of which you answered, which was like, okay, but what actually is the Nanak thing, which I've always wondered. So thank you for sort of clarifying that. And then I guess another thing, and I don't know, sort of, I mean, I don't know how much exposure you've had, or sort of how subjective a perspective one has to answer this. But, I remember like one of the teachers that we had together, Rav Mordechai at the CY, I once had a conversation with him about Nachman, and he brought up the biography that Art Green wrote about him, which sort of like does a little bit of like psychiatric sort of diagnosing. Yeah. And, the point that Rav Mordechai made was, he said, to say it's a great commandment to be happy all the time is not a thing that happy people say, right? Like that's not, and so I'm sort of wondering, like, as much like I can sort of, it's one thing for this to be formulated in this like religious language when you're sort of like in this fundamentalist mode and you're just like drenched in cortisol and like everything, oh, there's this song and the letter, but sort of like your experience with these people, like what's behind this just intense performance of joy, and sort of how much sadness and how much anxiety and how much all of that is there kind of just below the surface. And I'm also kind of curious if you have any insight. I mean, there's this wonderful book called Sanity and Sanctity about doing mental health work in Mea Shearim, and they talk a lot about the Nanak Bali Tshuva community, and I'm sort of curious how this intersects with like that kind of work, right? Who's getting caught up in this net, and what's it doing for them?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It's such a deep topic, and not just about this, but about religion and movements in general, right? I think the book Reb Mordechai was referring to is probably Tormented Master, which I think was Art Green's dissertation when he got a PhD, I think. And I'm sure Henry has it in the collection. He opens that book with a really profound quote, which I love. And the quote is by Rabbi Nathan, who was Rabbi Nachman's disciple, who wrote down his tales and most of his teachings. He was sort of like his recorder. And Rabbi Natan said, is that the book, Henry? Beautiful. Very nice. Very nice. Yeah, so if you open that book, you'll see in the beginning what he says, what Rabbi Natan says is, before I met my master, Rabbi Nachman, I never understood how Moshe Rabbeinu could actually be a human being. But after I met Rabbi Nachman, my teacher, I understood that you could be just as great as Moshe Rabbeinu and still be a complete human being. And I think what he was saying was, at least in one sense, what he was saying was, so much of that torment and so much of those real human experiences is what really generates that Torah. And for most, and I think we have this sort of this concept of receiving Torah of, it's just received. It's something that's transmitted, that's handed over to us. And I think Torah is much more hard won than that. I think if you're going to become a genius in your, and by all accounts, I think Rabbi Nachman was a genius, of course. I think you have to go through a lot of intense human experiences in order to get to that level of insight. And then I think from that brokenness, and our Korean delves into this a bit in the book, but I think it's from that brokenness that Torah really starts to emerge. And that's an interesting question then, why radical joy and why radical happiness? And, Misha Nichnas Adar Marbin Bisimcha, those who bring in Adar should do so with basically with radical joy is what that's saying. Before we get to Purim, you need to experience this feeling of radical joy. What does that mean to say that that's your service, that's your commitment to God? And I have to imagine that for Rabbi Nachman, if joy was something that came easily to him, then that wouldn't be service because he didn't have to sacrifice anything. I think the fact that joy was probably something that was hard for him to come by, and maybe his default setting was depression, perhaps. I mean, he was a tormented master, as Arkreen says. That's why that was his service, because joy was so hard for him,
And to follow up, Leon's question was, did you experience that kind of same personality battle within the disciples that you met of Saba?
They all vary, I would say. And his closest disciple, who I actually met at Saba's kever, at Saba's grave. Saba is buried on Har HaMenuchot, which is a big cemetery that's right outside. If you know where the famous gate, Seitchem L'Shalom, when you leave Jerusalem, and does it say Bruchim Habayim, I think, on the other side when you enter. So right where that sign is where Har HaMenuchot is, and I met his chief disciple there the first time. A guy like him, I felt, did live in that world. Where he was happy all the time because he was a close follower of Saba, and that was essentially Saba's story, and that was his Torah. And then I was close to other followers of Saba who I think really struggled with that. I think oftentimes if you're in your life, if you're waiting for the Mashiach to come and you're really excited in your 20s about the Mashiach coming, and now all of a sudden you're in your 60s and you don't think the Mashiach is here, that starts to eat away at you a bit. What's taking so long? And I thought if I did this, it would happen already. And I think for a lot of followers that might be a truth that's really hard to digest at a certain point. I also think just in terms of cultic personalities, and by the way, I don't mean cultic in a negative sense. I mean it as in he started a movement and he had followers. I think people will try to make the charismatic leader into whoever they want to make the charismatic leader. They want to make him into somebody. They want to give him a persona. So if he's a charismatic leader who all of a sudden is the Mashiach, that's not because the charismatic leader necessarily said they were the Mashiach. It might mean that there's a group of followers who desperately want him to be their Mashiach, right? And so I think we get a whole range of personalities who these people attract. And some of them will be radically joyous, and other people will be searching for meaning and will carry all those demons with them into the movement too. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you. So next couple of things I want to do is, first of all, we're 45 minutes in. I have this Zoom meeting open for another hour and 15. As long as if you guys have more questions, there might be more answers. But before I go to Dylan's question, I want Henry to come over here and show the spoils of the bookstore for everyone.
This is it says that it's interviews. It's a kind of peculiar thing. It may be that Saba never wrote this book, but it may be that this is sort of like a Rabbi Nachman type thing where his followers collected what he said. I was reading from it earlier, and he would describe things from his own experience, and when he talked about suffering as a child, he would frequently sort of stop in what he was saying with an oi oi. So I think that this is literally conversations that were had with him. Anyone who's interested, I have a phone number in Israel that purports to be a place where you can acquire this book, and we can provide that later.
Yeah, this is a full service shul. We don't just do learning. We don't just do davening. We have full connections to any sefer, anywhere, anytime.
I don't want to make that promise.
I want to make that promise. Okay.
You have to call some number. You have to like, oh yeah, I got a number here. You call that guy, he'll tell you to send you over here.
Look, you can't do it any other way when it's the holier something is, the more obscure alleys and numbers you have to call or walk down. I mean, I had my tefillin repaired through a lot of dark alleys. Like I had to wander a lot of dark alleys, and it was worth it. They're very holy tefillin. Anyway, Dylan, you had a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you guys so much. This is like really, really fascinating, and really glad to be here. One of my questions is, I know you weren't specifically here to talk about Chabad, but I was curious because you brought it up. How do you think the following of like the Nanachs, how would you compare the people that are drawn to that versus the people, especially in Israel, that are drawn kind of not into like necessarily even Chabad itself, but kind of into the general following of like the Rebbe, like Lubavitcher Rebbe? And do you think that those attachments are particularly tied at all to the philosophies of the Rebbes, or have they taken on kind of a life on their own? That's kind of the one thing I'm curious about. And then the other one I'm curious about is, how do you think the relationship between the Nanachs and the rest, and like non-Nanach Breslovs, how has that changed? Like how is that currently functioning, kind of?
Yeah, awesome.
Could I just interpose for a second?
Sure.
My experience in Borough Park, dealing with the booksellers in Borough Park, even like 5 and 10 years ago, to go into those stores, you would never see anything Breslov or anything Rabbi Nachman on the shelf. You might be able to get it from the bookseller, but you would have to ask them for it, and it would be underneath the counter. So it's not. It's like within the Haredi world, it is still not all kumbaya.
Right. So to talk about your first question, I think first it's really important to note, when I first started studying Chassidut and the different lineages, it is a complex world in terms of the lineages, because a lot of the credibility that comes from certain Hasidic masters or leaders comes from their pedigree. So the first thing to know is Chabad originated with somebody who wasn't a direct follower of the Baal Shem Tov, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who's also known as the Alter Rebbe, and he is Baal HaTanya. So he wrote this very influential book called the Tanya. And I think if some Chabad people were watching this, they probably wouldn't agree, but this is to the extent of, this is what I learned from my studies. Shneur Zalman of Liadi was not a direct follower of the Baal Shem Tov. He was a direct follower of the Maggid of Mezrich. So the Maggid of Mezrich was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, who then taught Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And then from there, that sparked the Chabad movement. So that's Chabad. And during the Baal Shem Tov's life, he received a message from Shemayim. It wasn't in the form of a petek, it was probably in the form of a vision that said, in order, and this is really interesting because now you're going to start to see the similarities of these movements, in order for the Mashiach to come, the Baal Shem Tov's Torah needs to spread throughout the entire world. And so what the Lubavitcher Rebbe did, and I agree with Chabad when they say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a once in a 1,000-year rabbi. I mean, he was an absolutely incredible human being, who in his own lifetime mobilized, what's the number, about 4,000 rabbis in his lifetime to go move to the most obscure corners of the earth and just set up little shoals and start basically teaching Chassidut from their houses and literally trying to take that message and spread it throughout the world. And also up until the Rebbe died, I think in 1993. And he was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody knows the actual, I think he was the 7th in the line of the Chabad Rebbes. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the prophecy.
And he didn't die.
And sorry, thank you, Natan. And he didn't die. I recognize that voice anywhere. And he and he didn't die. Anyway, so 7 generations. The prophecy said that in the 7th generation, Chabad would explode and the Torah would travel all across the earth. And then the person immediately before the Lubavitcher Rebbe was his father-in-law, and it was still a tiny movement. 6 generations later, and then all of a sudden, the Lubavitcher Rebbe becomes the head of Chabad, and the movement totally explodes, which is completely in line with what they said was going to happen 200 years before that. And they're spreading.
That's Baltanya or Baltanya's prophecy or prophecy? Or?
I don't actually know who said the prophecy. I just know that was one of their the belief. Yeah, Leanne, do you know?
Well, so there's a very good write-up. I think it's by Tomer Persico of the Hartman Institute, called I think Chabad's Lost Messiah or something, which talks about the development of this very particular messianic ideology. And my sense is that a lot of it kind of was made in I think the generation of like the 5th and 6th Rebbes, and was very much tied up in the Shoah and their understanding of that and birth pangs of the Messiah and sort of that whole operation that happens during Jewish cataclysms. Yeah,
absolutely, for sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. So that's sort of that's the beginning of Chabad. In 3 minutes, and that's also that lineage. So there was a student of the Baal Shem Tov who influenced Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and off of that came Chabad. Rabbi Nachman is the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. So Rabbi Nachman is actually in the genetic line of the Baal Shem Tov. And he died when he was 38 years old. I don't remember what the cause was of why he died. But also what he felt in his lifetime was he did have this messianic impulse that his Torah needed to be spread throughout the world in order for the Messiah to come. And that's what the followers' mission became. So he started really the Breslover movement of Hasidism. And now to get into your second question, Breslov was something that began with Rabbi Nachman and his followers and then continues into this day. So in Sfat, they have a really beautiful Breslov shul that's right above the famous cemetery where you have Yosef Cairo is buried there, the Arizal is buried there, and others. Alkabetz, who wrote Lechad Odi, is buried right next to the Arizal. It's a really amazing place. It's like all the big players are there. So they are a movement distinct and of their own. And like I said before, Saba was a Breslover because he found it. He didn't found, but he became a Breslover when he was younger. And then from finding this petek with Nanak Nachman Meuman, started sort of a branched movement, a fringe movement out of the Breslov movement. That's not the same movement, but it definitely derives from that movement. So he claimed during his lifetime that he went to, and I also don't know if he claimed it or if his followers claimed it in his name. It's not really clear. That he went to all the elders of Breslov to get their stamp of approval on the letter that he had found. And apparently there's a list of 20 rabbis from the Breslover movement. If you go on any Nach website, they'll be listed there by name, who they were, who said this is a real and holy letter and the name Nanak Nachman Meuman needs to be popularized. That being said, did that actually happen? Nobody knows, but that's part of the story. So you're going to have those Breslovers who probably love what Nanak does because they take Rabbi Nachman's teaching and really spread it far and wide. And you'll have those purists who really don't like it and think that they're diluting the brand.
You know, go ahead.
I think I might confuse my questions a little bit. That's my bad. I paused just in the first one, but thank you for that. That was wonderful. One thing I think I meant for the first one was in talking about them both kind of being not like mainline Chabad and not mainline Breslov, but in terms of kind of the followings of both the Lubavitcher Rebbe and like Nach's respectively, kind of being folk movements in Israel. Why do you think drives like one person to be like a Lubavitcher, kind of put the Lubavitcher on their wall versus to be a Nach kind of? I think.
Right. Yeah, that was your question. Sorry about that.
No worries.
No, but yeah, that's also a great question. I think it honestly often what it comes down to is personality and energetically where you're drawn to. So I think you will have those people who are, at this point, thousands, if not millions of people, Jews and non-Jews, who are deeply, deeply drawn to the Rebbe. And they want to be close to the Rebbe. And when they become followers of Chabad, all of a sudden the Rebbe is their Rebbe. and they study his teachings and do what he told them to do. And you have a huge infrastructure of thousands and thousands of Chabad rabbis all over the world who meet up in Crown Heights. Was it every year they have their conference, and you become a part of that. And then you'll have your people who love to dance and sing and shout and experience radical joy and want to spray paint vans and literally drive around Israel, jump out, start dance parties, get invited by weddings to come in and get the wedding party started. Which is, by the way, that's also happening. It's now become a new cultural phenomenon that people hire non-nachers to come to the wedding just to be themselves for like 20 minutes, get the energy really high, and then like it never happened, they will run out and drive away.
Amazing.
And people throughout Israel do this because who doesn't want a crazy wedding party? And these people can provide. So if that's more your personality, if that's what you're drawn to, you're going to go down that route.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is that we're at the hour mark. So if anyone, if there's some sort of time pressure just in your life, I know that I sometimes lose track of time. Just wanting to know that it is now about 3 o'clock Pacific. I was going to make a quick mention of the Chabad lineage thing that I thought just popped up in my mind, which is that just as the Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the 7th Rebbe in his line, and he was supposed to be a messianic figure. I think that I believe that Hasidism itself is this weird sort of parallel to certain aspects of Islam, and that in the Shiite Islamic lore, the 7th Mahdi is the one of the different. There's a line of Mahdis who go down, and the 7th one is like kind of cut off from the line, and eventually when the 7th Mahdi comes back, however that comes, that brings some sort of Islamic messianism. So there's a interesting parallel. For at least in my mind, did anybody have any burning questions that are that you'd like to? Oh wait, Leon, your hand was up a while ago. No.
Yeah, but you ended up answering it in response to Dylan's question. So thanks, Dylan.
Zach, are y'all going to talk about your project and such as well? I'd love to hear about it as well. I mean, as well as more about Nanak.
Yeah. Sure.
We'll come back to that when we're really sure where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, if we'll ask a few more questions. I think if people have been nanached thoroughly, then we'll get to who we are and what's going on and that sort of thing.
Nanached out.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if anyone else has. I pause one more follow up. I'm curious. So in terms of kind of on the last one, so do you think Nanachs, now that they're so or at least because they've become such a thing in the past like couple decades, have they gotten any more mainstream acceptance within kind of the traditional Breslov hierarchy, or are they still very trying to keep their distance, do you think?
Yeah, personally, that's also a great question. I don't really, I don't know, because I lived in Spot for about 4 or 5 months. And while I was there, I lived right above the Breslov Shoal. And what I was always struck by was that the Breslovers, even though you're free to come in, you're free to dive in and study, are still a very fringe movement in a certain way. I think that they're a big movement, but I think it's kind of like either you're in or out is sort of the feeling that I got from them. Now, I'm sure they do kiruv to some extent. I don't think it's as extreme as the Nanak movement. But yeah, I would have to imagine like all fringe movements, including even the Baal Shem Tov himself. When you start out, the mainstream doesn't like you. And then as you start to gain steam and develop a following, acceptance comes with that.
Yeah, I think I want to go into the relationship between Breslov and Nanach, because that's a very interesting topic. Because what happened, the reason why Chabad Lubavitch is so different from this situation is that Lubavitch became Chabad. One of the interesting stories that I remember reading about was that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was competing with other people to become the next Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was competing with people who should have gotten it and not him, because he was a relatively more secular person. He was living in like France with like a pseudo secular life, and he was wearing a fedora instead of the shtreimel all the time. So when his authority was being challenged and said, you're not from enough for this, He just put on a fedora and made everyone else in the Lubavitch community wear a fedora, and that's why they wear fedoras. So Lubavitch was fully taken over by Chabad because that's how their hierarchy worked. But Nanach and Breslov like exist in parallel, though they do meet up in certain places like Uman. Like, what do you think is the relationship they have when Uman comes around, and like what is Uman like, and what is it? You might not have been, but like what's it for? What's it for the Breslov, and what's it for Nanach?
Yeah, and I think Uman is for pilgrimage. I think that is one of, besides coming to Jerusalem, that's one of the major pilgrimage sites among Jews. That they get about 50,000 people a year. That number probably continues to grow. I'm pretty sure, despite the pandemic, you will still see thousands of people this year go to Uman in the next couple of weeks for Rosh Hashanah. But you go to Uman, and then you're sort of in the larger neighborhood of all the tzaddikim and all their graves. So you go to Uman, you can go visit the Baal Shem Tov, you can go visit the Maggid of Mezrich, you can kind of go on a whole tour, and there are people who make a week of it and just go visit these different tzaddikim. And the real thought, and this is not just in Uman, these are graves, any holy Rav's grave throughout Israel, you will find people at that grave asking some kind of petitionary prayer, asking for some kind of help. Because the thought is that it's not that the Rav themselves are going to answer the prayer, but it's that the Rav sort of acts energetically acts as sort of a phone line to God. That if you're in the presence of this grave, and if you make a prayer there, your prayer becomes so much more powerful because you basically have that Rav on your side helping guide that prayer. That's the belief.
And everybody is comfortable just seeing each other and being with each other, no matter which sect they're from.
I would imagine. I would imagine that it's some big love fest for these Ravs when you go.
Yeah. One thing that I want to make this a little personal for you, which is that I know you're a person who is really comfortable with laughter and really like and that radical joy, and like that lives within you. And I feel like sometimes that sort of strikes a difficult battle with the world around you sometimes. Were you like strengthened or encouraged by your time at Nanak to really hold on to that as a virtue within yourself?
Yeah, I think so. And I just want to also just clarify, I wasn't really a member of, I was more Nanak adjacent, if you will. I lived with a person who said that he was Saba's, one of his inner circle followers. And so through him and through the people he knew, I was exposed to that world in a very personal way. I was never riding in a van though, jumping up and down, screaming, that kind of thing. But to get back to your question, yes, I think that goes back to Dylan's thing of, why do some people go down this route and why do some people go down this other route? Often just through the journey and through the exploration, you find streams that really resonate with you in certain ways. And you'll find certain Rebbes who every teaching they tell you, it's like, wow, okay, truth, makes sense. But that's not going to make sense to everybody. It's going to make sense to you because of who you are. And that's why you have to find your rabbi. So to ever say that there's only one rabbi or there's only one person you should follow is a completely ridiculous thing to say, because everybody should have multiple Rebbes in their life. And those Rebbes are going to serve different purposes for you throughout your life.
Well, if nobody has any additional questions, I just, you do?
I have a couple.
All right, go ahead, Aaron. Sorry.
Which are a motley pair. You talked about the group of, it's okay. You talked about the group that went to Saba when he was in the nursing home, and sort of accepted him as their teacher. How did they end up there? How did they locate him?
Right.
I mean, do you know that story?
So I don't know specifically who was the person who went and found him first. I'll tell you that the person who I met him twice. First time was at Saba's kever. The second time, he actually bought me a shawarma, which was really sweet. what he told me, his story, when I said, how did you find Saba in the first place? He told me that he was at the kotel davening, and that he was screaming at the kotel, like he was screaming in pain because he was in such existential suffering, and that Saba in the nursing home heard his cries and sent one of his students to go find this person, to go to the kotel. He said, I've never heard somebody scream like this. You need to go to the kotel and bring him to me. And that's the story. And then he says, and that's how I found my way to Saba. So that's the story that he tells. And because that's his story, you know, that it wasn't just I wandered in one day, I heard a tip. There was a whole mysterious origin story to how that happened in the first place. And to him, like, that's as far as it goes. I was screaming at the kotel. Saba was the tzaddik of the generation. He heard my cries and he invited me in, and then I became his disciple for the next 20 years.
The other question I have is completely different question. The type of, is there a difference between the type of music that the Nachman people have in sort of like their internal orientation and their external orientation? Like is the music on the street closer to club music, and the internal music closer to traditional Hasidic stuff? How, like, what kind of, is there kind of multiple musical cultures, and how does that play out?
Yeah, so I feel like, Zach, you might be better equipped to answer this question because you know much more about music than I do. I know that in terms of the kiruv music, I think it's usually the loud house type music, and I also think I think that the whole Hasidic world are very, very into, and Zach, maybe you can talk about this a little bit more. Very into compositions, very into melodies and nigunim, and adapting tefillot in certain ways. I remember I was camping once in Park HaYarden, and there was a whole group of Hasids, like a couple of campsites away, and they were just singing these unbelievable nigunim the entire night, because that's just what they do. Like they'll go into the forest and they'll sing. And I remember thinking at the time that it was like the most beautiful song I had ever heard, and that we know a couple nigunim that come from the Hasidic world, but it's because they're leaked into our world. And just because those couple are leaked doesn't mean that they're not still producing music on their end, which they are. So I have to imagine that for a movement that's all about song and the song of the redemption, they must have musicians that are just making different compositions all the time. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of points. One is, like, it was brought up earlier that it's a very inter-ethnic movement. I mean, like, Chabad Lubavitch became that way, but it was still dominated by Ashkenazi song. That's not so clear that that's happened for the Nach world. It seems as though anybody who's willing to get into that world will put their spin. But what they'll do is they'll take Breslov Nigunim, like you'll hear Mitzvah Gedola, which is very much a Breslov old-fashioned traditional nigun. You'll hear it in a Breslov shul or whatever, but you'll hear it remixed in a lot of different varieties, whether it's like house trance or it's like Mizrahi pop or whoever is doing it. So what you'll kind of do is, like, I think in the Nach world, that they have a certain library of nigunim, and then they just remix it in a variety of different ways. Because you have to remember, these people aren't grown. To know these kinds of nigunim that you're talking about, Brett, you have to grow up with them or really be absorbed with them to have like a big library in your mind. And they're massively complex. So this sort of group will just take ones that are the most important as far as they know, and just constantly remix them. There could be in their Shabbos table, like, just singing those, like the basic version of them. But yeah, and then when you walk back into the Breslov world, where they're not Balei Tshuva, where they're not from this wide variety of ethnic ranges, then you get the nigunim plus other things. I did used to go to a Breslov shul in Jerusalem a lot, and there were a lot of like Breslovers for life kind of people. And there were also a lot of people who were just interested in, I think, drawn in by the success of Nanak. and by Breslov. Breslov also has its own kiruv, like you were talking about. And so people were into also the same songs over and over again, but you did have these anchors in Breslov who like did have this real library of songs that might not be accessible to
Where was that
non-Anarchists.
shul, Zach?
That was great question. That was down Rachel Hamalka. What's that street?
Eli Menu.
Rachel Imenu. Yeah. That
Like,
makes more
is it
sense.
like how big? I'm just curious. I never knew that. Like a little shul or like a big.
It was like mid-size. It was by a hospital near the monastery. Down. Yeah. I don't know.
Sorry, I wasn't reacting to you. I was reacting to the legends of the UK making hand gestures.
Yeah, but anyway, I think this will be a good place to leave off. Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you so much for everyone who came, everyone who's watching. Brett, this was a huge mitzvah to volunteer your time and your expertise and experience to start this.
It's a total honor. Total honor. So wishing you and Henry much luck as this takes off now. And like I said before, I'm very excited to see where it goes.
Well, I'll tell you where it's going to go. Next week, we have Leon teaching on Albert Mehme. I'd like you to say a couple words on that, if you'd like, Leon.
Sure. So with the requisite disclaimer that I'm just a guy who has read some Mehme and likes it, and I'm not an expert or anything like that. I'm just going to talk. I want to open up a little conversation. Mehme died. So for people who don't know, Albert Mehme was a Tunisian Jewish writer who just died a couple of months ago at the age of 99. And so this is sort of like an in memoriam, and he wrote a lot about the Tunisian struggle for independence against the French. He was sort of a great anti-colonial writer. He wrote this landmark book in 1956 called The Colonizer and the Colonized. But he also had a certain marginality from the Tunisian people because of his Jewishness. And so he would also write about the way in which in the colonial situation, the Jews were sort of caught between the colonized and the colonizers, and the way in which an independent Tunisia made him happy, but also alienated him. So he had a very important perspective, I think, on what it is to be Jewish in the world, on Zionism and the Jewish experience in the Arab world. And I just want to open up that conversation with the Der Nister community, which seems to be getting off the ground.
Thanks, Leon. Yeah, that I'm really excited for that. I kind of just pick speakers for this based on who's really enthused about what they're talking about, and that I think both of you fit that category very firmly, and it makes me very happy. So I want to go in for a couple minutes about who we are and what we're doing. Henry, get in the frame. Yeah. So the concept of Der Nister is, I mean, I used to go to downtown LA frequently by train. I grew up in Long Beach, California, and I always was fascinated about the growth of downtown, which had sort of died as a neighborhood 100 some years ago, but had been coming, or 50 years ago, but had started coming back in recent years. And I realized there were a lot of Jews living here, working here, but not really in a collected community of any sort. And when I graduated Ziegler, I thought, well, there is something to be said for a part of LA that's really integrated, where people are really living amongst each other, Jews and non-Jews alike, with no particular cultural markers one way or another. There's a lot of culture. There's a lot of work to be done to make the neighborhood better. And there's a lot of open-mindedness. And in this sort of petri dish, this is a place where Judaism can be refashioned to a certain extent to be something that has a certain kind of intensity and realness and cultural awareness to break away from some of the old institutions of the past and the trauma that they came from, and that the need to fit into the American bourgeois mainstream, or the need to eliminate old cultures like the old Mizrahi cultures or old Yiddish-speaking cultures, and create something in an open-minded environment, in a culturally accepting environment, that would be able to give Jews or bring people together, giving people the strength of their culture and their heritage on overcoming the years of relative overwashing of a lot of our history and culture. That's sort of the long version, but here we are up in this bookstore, and it's very particular that it's this bookstore. I don't know what you say about that.
Well, Zach has more to say about the bookstore than I do. I think the vision of what we want to do that sort of works for Zach and I is an idea of a more global Jewish experience, that we want to create a place where people can experience Judaism in a whole variety of different ways that can ultimately bleed into each other. That Judaism is not synagogue Judaism. It's not political Judaism. It's not historical Judaism. It's like an entire a globally involving way of being in the world. And in the sense that it's a restoration, we actually we want to try to go back to a kind of psychology which is I don't know, it's a kind of dialectical progression of reproducing pre-assimilation, pre-American assimilation, from like the post-war period. We want people to just be finding Jewish stuff in every direction that they go in, and not force people to go in one direction to get it.
Yeah.
It's so we're really intending to be not directly in competition with any existing Jewish organization.
Yeah, and when you walk into this bookstore, this has been a work of art, I think. You walk in here and you experience that entire pre-assimilated civilization around you, and you understand that it's not something strange or a forlorn memory, but it's actually living within you. That it's you don't have to be ashamed about the way you speak, the way you act, how you are, because all of those things are real and important, and were completely normal, and can be again, because when you're surrounded with it. And aside from that, like the various avenues that of things that were once sort of frowned upon or scorned and we want to make normal are like interesting intellectual discussions and spiritual discussions about aspects of Jewish life. We want to put together a Yiddish discussion group, Yiddish classes. We're gonna try and put on prayer services that are free for me or whoever to just actually sing and actually be fully alive and not stilted by American convention. And downtown and the people we want to go on this journey with us, I think, are all interested in this certain kind of freedom, not just from Israel, the Holocaust, the usual subjects, but actually the full sense of their selves allowed to speak. So I know that was a very abstract, but what I'm trying to say is that at 8 o'clock, we're going to put on some Mariv and Slichot, and it'll be a good time. So that's where I'll end that rant.
The only thing that I want to add to that is that we are sort of looking to. Zach was more specific about we have this and that we're actually working on specifically at this minute. But we feel like there are a lot of people out there with sort of Jewish messages that are not getting heard well enough. And I think we're happy to function a little bit as sort of like the salon refusé, where all of the people who have been told no, maybe actually have a chance to have an effect on the community. So
and I believe that there are more of them than people who have been told yes, who have something to say, and there's a reason for that. But yeah, and also a Beit Midrash will be coming soon, maybe. So there are a lot of promises. But anyway, 8:00 tonight, I think, will be Mariv and Slichot. We'll see if that works. Should if it doesn't, I'll see you. We'll see you all next week. And thank you so much for coming.
You guys so much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys, thank you so much for this opportunity. And Leon, looking forward to what you're going to do next week.
Yep.
I'm psyched. Thank you, Zach. Thank
Nice
you,
seeing
Henry.
you all.
This is
All
great.
right.
Thank you, Brett. Bye.